Thank you guys for showing up here for this session. We think it's incredibly important and definitely something in our day-to-day that dominates a ton of our time and our conversations that we're having with the home office and also with advisors. With that, before we jump in and start talking about strategic compensation and exactly what that means first as a starting point, Allison, if you wouldn't mind just a little level set, let people know a little bit about you, Snowden Lane, and your role there, please.
Great, thank you. Allison Burkett, and I'm one of the founding partners at Snowden Lane. We are a hybrid broker-dealer RIA, and about $13 billion in client assets and 85 amazing advisors across the country.
Beautiful.
Excellent.
Shannon?
It's so great to be here. Loving the beach. I'm Shannon Spotswood. I'm the CEO at RFG Advisory. We are a platform serving independent advisors. We help them build their business without compromise by driving organic growth to create appreciating enterprise value.
All right, so let's just get right into it. The session title is Strategic Compensation. We're looking at recruiting, retaining, and developing top talent. Each one of those three things could be their own panel, right? So we've got a lot in front of us here, but let's just actually start, and Allison, if you could kick us off. When we're talking about strategic compensation, we're obviously not just talking about throwing as much money as humanly possible at anyone, right? What is strategic compensation in your view?
So for our firm, strategic compensation, we cover a lot of different roles, and you talk about the recruitment, strategic organizational structure of recruiting the right talent to the firm, and retaining that talent, having a career pathway from the various roles within the firm, as well as ongoing improvements and how do you engage with your talent to really excel the growth of your company and align the interests of all of the partners within your firm to really push your path forward.
And Shannon, when you think about it, if you wouldn't mind also not just adding your take on what is strategic compensation, but if you're looking at a plan that is truly strategic, what are some key elements there?
So I gave a lot of thought to this, and I came up with a formula that's really been guiding our talent strategy. And it's P plus E plus M minus N. So purpose plus engagement plus money minus negativity. And I think that as you think about strategic compensation, those are the four key components. So purpose, you have to have clarity around what is your mission. People can't stay motivated over the long term without a very clear mission, without purpose tied to it. Engagement. This is the idea of having clarity around your career path, around the impact that you are having on that mission from the role that you play day to day. Money, I think that we're all in a position in our industry, we are in a war for talent, not just within the industry, but with the outside. So we want to compensate our people at the absolute highest level that we can for the impactful work that they're doing. And then minus negativity. And it's not just around mindset. It really is around how are you thinking about the cadence of communication in your organization? How are you structuring meetings? How are you helping people to eliminate attending too many meetings? How are you helping them to maximize their time so that they have that positive orientation? And if you blend those four ingredients together and you put it through the filter of your firm, I think that gives you a good baseline to think about strategic compensation.
So that's it. Shannon, you just gave everybody the answer. You all have 20 minutes back. Thank you very much. Good work. Now, I do want to go a little bit deeper, right, because I think fundamentally you both just laid out what the perfect foundation is. When we talked a couple of weeks ago, you used the word alignment a lot, right? So I do think it's really important to talk about what does that actually mean? How do you apply that in compensation plans? I would also just throw one other sort of comma, and it's not just about the money. If somebody wants to develop professionally, how are you making sure that you're putting a plan in place that aligns that individual's development with the overall growth and the objectives for the firm? So, Allison.
So, and I think that's why this idea of retention is so important to strategic compensation, because to have that pathway where somebody can see themselves at your firm 5 years from now and see themselves having grown, I think that's such an important component of the strategic compensation currently. So when we talk about alignment of interests, for us, it's really taking, or any firm, it's really taking your organizational goals and filtering that down and identifying team goals from a practice management standpoint, all the way down to the individual. So if an individual feels motivated and feels a part of driving the growth of the overall firm, that's a retention tool. That's where they feel the success alongside of their teammates, all the way up to the organization. And tactically, that doesn't always mean it's about the money. Yes, there's equity structures. Yes, there's incentive payments, but without an understanding of your contribution to that overall firm growth and firm goal, I think you lose sight of that long-term 5-year plan for you as an individual, and just strive for that immediate compensation structure. So when I think about strategic compensation, it's not the annual review. It is, where am I seeing myself grow with this firm?
And Shannon, from your view, I mean, when you think about the alignment, right, and ways to make it work for the individual, not just in the short term, right, but medium and long term, and work for the firm, how do you think about it?
I think this is really a rally cry for leadership. And it is one of the greatest challenges for our industry as we prepare for this generational wealth transfer, what we just heard on the prior panel about the changing expectations of an advisor's clients. So we're living in a time where that leadership and that clarity around what role are you playing, how are you communicating that mission and that message to your team, and then that becomes like such the critical baseline for thinking about compensation. And I'm going to give you a very specific example, is that it is, if you double click on engagement, what we have found is that whether they're advisors or your team, they have very clear ideas of what would make them happy, what would give them greater motivation every day as they come in and give you their most valuable resource, their time. So we've leveraged a lot of tools that are getting close to the source. So a great tactical example is around taking a survey, whether it's an annual survey or a twice a year survey, about what is working and what is missing in our culture as it relates to alignment, as it relates to engagement with your team. And what we found was some very specific things. Number one was around learning. There is a real hunger for our teams to have access to very robust on-demand learning modules. If you haven't checked out LinkedIn Learning, it's one of the best tools that's very accessible to everyone. Number two is learning together. There is a demand for and an appetite for a book club or a seminar series or something where you can do a lunch and learn together, grow together. And then there's some very specific things that we learned that might seem minor, but really speak to this, like, I hear you, here is our mission, here is our purpose, and I'm going to do everything I can to help you be successful in your role. And what we found is that our team members wanted two very specific things. They wanted a quarterly wellness bonus to be able to spend on a new treadmill, to be able to spend on new running shoes, a massage, whatever it might be, and pet insurance. Pet insurance. So I share that because at the surface level, that's so easy. Yep. It is so accessible. And so if you take this top-down view that as leaders, it is your responsibility to provide clarity around the mission and your purpose, and then you get really down into the guts of what is going to help your people feel very valued and feel very connected to that mission, and it can be as simple as pet insurance and wellness as a part of the overall equation.
Yeah, and I think the point about pet insurance, while very specific, is a really good example that there's compensation and then there's the total reward, right? And I think there's an increasing amount of value that's being placed on that total reward. and being part of a great firm that actually cares about its employees and their pets too. So thank you for bringing that up. There is an important thread that I think when I was talking to Matt Middleton months ago about this conference, he said he was going to try and pull off a 4-day event that didn't have the word growth in one session. I don't know if he actually did that. But I do want to talk about organic growth because it seems like we're constantly talking about it at every conference. There's articles, blogs, podcasts about it every day. And the narrative is that the industry is not really truly growing organically. We know when we're talking about an industry with thousands and thousands of firms, sure, that will probably be true more often than it is not. But when we look at the firms that are truly growth oriented, right, and we look at the firms that are not only adding new clients, but are deepening relationships with their existing clients, they're doing things very, very differently, not just from a recruiting perspective, but from a comp perspective. So maybe we can talk about that for a little bit and just sort of anchor. And Allison, if there are specific things that Snowden Lane is doing from a comp or even just a talent development perspective that if tactically translated to organic growth, I'd love to hear about it.
Absolutely. I think, that organic growth is the buzzword at this point, and you have to think about how do you drive that from a practice management standpoint, and how do you drive that tactically through compensation, incentives. So there's always going to be a combination of the two. And I think one of the, most important items to remember is information and sharing of information is key to that. People won't know how they are doing unless they are aware of if they are growing organically, are their peers growing organically, who's doing it well, how can I improve? So one of the things that we do at Snowden Lane is we share on a monthly basis, on a no-names basis, all of our team's information with the partners. Who's growing, how are they growing, and then we offer on our monthly partners call for one of our top growers to share a story. So bringing it down to a realistic story of how you're growing your book. From a compensation standpoint, there's incentives around payment structures for those new clients, for those net new assets. But I think for our structure, one of the most important drivers is this alignment of incentives that I mentioned earlier. Organizationally, our advisors are partners and equity holders in the firm. And so for us to share success, share stories of success is really important as a motivation factor because, looking around the room, everyone here is successful for a reason. Competitive, motivation, how am I doing relative to my peers? That is such an important, from a partnership lens, of course, but also how can I be doing better? And there's always a better way of doing things. And so we encourage the storytelling of how that's approaching, in addition to the tactical compensation incentives around net new assets.
Sure, and I think that's a great framework. And Shannon, I would ask you the same question just around levers you can pull from a comp perspective to drive organic growth. And that being said, we know there's not one thing that all of a sudden you put it in place and you go from 4% organic growth to 25% year over year. But is there anything specific that you've done or that you're thinking about, right, that translates to solid organic growth rates?
I mean, we are obsessed with organic growth. It's one of the fundamental drivers of our platform and part of our value proposition. And the way that we see the industry is that, and this is consistently showing up in all the data, right now advisors continue to spend 80% of their time on non-revenue generating activities. So it's not a surprise that organic growth in our industry is in the 2 to 3% range. You couple that with the fact that there is a massive underinvestment being made in storytelling, in brand building. If you look at an advisor's average practice, you're maybe spending 1 to 2% on marketing and branding, whereas high growth firms are close to spending double digits on that. So we really take all of those levers, and the first question that you have to ask as it relates specifically, Mark, to compensation is, how are you going to spend your time? You can have all the compensation structures in place. You can have alignment around your equity program. You can have incentives to be able to grow. But if you haven't solved for that number one barrier to organic growth, none of it matters. So this really requires a mindset shift, not only by the advisor, but by their team and how their team is being supported. And for us as a platform, we consider this one of the most important advantages of partnering with a platform is having someone who's going to help you remove friction from investment management, from compliance, from operations, from marketing, and from ultimately from your business development strategies. So I think that structuring a deal, we call it the art of the possible, a whiteboard to think about what is going to motivate me and how am I going to be compensated for organic growth is really not the right question. This is not a compensation question. This is a how are you going to spend your time to drive organic growth? And what I will tell you is that we're seeing our advisors growing organically by 19% year in and year out. And it's because their team is aligned around the mission of their firm. They're motivated to be doing the right thing. They have the tools in place to be force multipliers for their advisors. And their advisors are being disciplined around really spending their time where they should, which is driving organic growth. And then the compensation all falls from there.
Yeah, it really comes down to creating a framework for the right behaviors more than anything. It is interesting. One just very hyper tactical thing that I've noticed over the last couple of months, we have 19 firms that we have minority investments in. And there have been 2 firms very recently that have said, you know what, we obviously want to make sure the comp plans are aligned with our organic growth goals, but not all growth is good growth. So they've capped the number of relationships that the lead advisor can have, say at 100, right? They're only getting paid. If you want to take on 10 more clients, great, but you're only going to get paid on the top 100. That creates some sort of incentive for the advisor to start transitioning the smaller accounts to an assistant, right, or a level 2, level 3 advisor. And it's been interesting to see, right, because the lead advisor goes up market, goes after the larger client relationships. The younger advisor or the service support advisor is starting to build his or her own book too. So when you think about alignment and you think about plans, it won't necessarily solve all of your problems, but it's the little things that you can do to create these right behaviors, right? So interested if you guys have seen anything quite like that. Be interested to be back here in a year to see if anybody else has adopted that too after this session. I know we touched on organic growth, which is top of the list when it comes to mega trends, but we do have to talk about that mega trend when it comes to succession planning and talent, right? We've talked about it I've been in the industry for 20 years. We've been talking about the talent gap for 20 years, right? How many advisors are retiring every year? There's probably 2 retiring advisors for every 1 new entrance in a given year, right? How has that impacted compensation, first and foremost, and not just today in 2024, right? But as you look out over the next 5 to 10 years and that trend continues to play out, where do we go from here? Allison, start with you.
I think it's less of a compensation question, but more of that long-term strategy that we spoke to earlier, kind of that career pathing that you need to have to retain both the younger talent, but also succession planning is really important to retaining advisors through retirement. If you do not have a solution set for those advisors that are looking to pass on their books, whether that be with personnel internally to take those books on, or some type of retirement program to help those advisors sunset their careers, you won't retain them. You'll end up losing them in the last 5, 8 years of their career to another firm. And so I think it's as much of a retention question and that strategic long-term compensation structure. For us, our approach to that is the practice management. So we are hyper-focused and passionate about a teams-based model. So that's from our recruitment of a team, full-based team, to adding in additional roles to really bring that next-gen advisor into a team that's been here for a while. So team structures have to do with the roles. We always talk about a finder, a minder, and a grinder, and kind of having that organic growth component from a role standpoint. But it also has to do with senior and junior and having a built-in succession plan. If your clients know the team, then they'll retain those clients as the senior advisor is able to retire.
Yeah, and I'd love, Shannon, to get your take on this as well. It feels like, I said 20 years, like a slow motion train wreck. It hasn't quite happened that way, but what's your experience been and how is it impacting recruiting and comp?
All right, so I think this is going to be somewhat of I don't know, maybe we're going to mix it up a little, stir the pot a little bit on this. The next generation of advisors is not interested in not sleeping. So the G1 advisors who I have just so much respect for, who have built these businesses, have all been grinders. And I think that we're at a moment right now where we need to think very seriously about fee structures and how much value you're giving away for free to your clients, and having the courage to have hard conversations and maybe lose some clients as you charge appropriate fees. I think we need to have some really hard conversations around what is optimized and professionalized business practice as it relates to workflows. Every single advisor in here, if you have multiple advisors in your firm, if you have one advisor, you need to adopt standardized workflows. And that means you're going to have to give a little. You can't have 5 advisors with their 5 special ways that they want to do something. You've got to be able to operationalize and professionalize, which allows you to align your team so everybody knows what they're doing. And I think that that is such a critical piece of this next gen and succession planning is operationalization and professionalization of your business. It is looking very strategically at your fee structure. It is thinking about the roles on your team and those that are left unfilled. Your admin is not a marketing expert. They are not going to carry you through that multi-generational transfer of wealth. So you've got to free up some profitability and some room in your P&L to be able to invest very strategically in the talent that you need to drive that organic growth, to retain that just rock star G2, G3 advisor who wants to be at their child's baseball game, who wants to be able to manage more clients, and who wants to have, I think, a disproportionately positive impact overall on their clients, but they're not willing to sacrifice their life to do it.
Yeah, and we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure before we came here, I put on LinkedIn, does anybody have any questions? And I would just sum up, the majority of the questions I got back were around equity or other types of long-term incentive plans. And it's not binary. It's not equity or no equity. I think if there are firm owners here and they're thinking about at what point could or should I distribute equity, or there are advisors who are thinking about at what point am I eligible, all right? Maybe we can work back this way, Shannon. You could start us off here. What's the decision-making process? What role does equity or other types of LTIPs play in sort of bridging that gap that you just mentioned?
I think that the first thing is to consider if, not everyone needs to be an equity holder in your firm. And if you decide you want to have a path for equity for your partners, for the next generation, you have to be very clear about the gates that they have to pass through in order to be eligible for equity. Nothing breeds more resentment than just giving away equity, where you've built the firm, you've put in the hard work, and all of a sudden you feel pressured to have an equity strategy. I think that there is an avenue for a W-2 client servicing advisor as well as team members, and then there's an avenue for equity partners. But you need to get very clear on what are your values, what are your expectations, whether it's on total AUM, new AUM, relationships managed, charitable work, charitable boards. Like, there's a lot of different components that are both, I think, very tangible to the business, but also intangible that tie back to your values. And it is within that construct that you start thinking about equity. And I think that the equity program doesn't need to be all or nothing out of the gate. Like, I like it where there's a way that you can build into equity as you continue to grow as leaders and as partners, because then you ultimately have that longer term alignment, which is absolutely critical to not having, finding yourself in a boardroom with everybody with lawyers on either side of the table trying to unwind your partnership because you weren't really aligned on vision, you weren't aligned on the future, and you weren't aligned on your values.
Yeah, I love that. Allison would love your take as well on it. It's not just about equity, right? But it is about finding that right long-term incentive plan to not only acknowledge but recognize someone's contribution. How important is it, and how are you guys thinking about it?
I think it's extremely important, and I think that communication that you mentioned of how to achieve that is paramount. I also think that there's very similar equity-like incentives. So you have profit sharing, you have different types of contribution plans that align with an equity program, it's not giving away the equity, but it is insight in terms of how the company is operating, how the company is performing, and you're aligning the employee's interest with those. So I think profit sharing is an incredible tool that's very equity-like, and has a long-term strategic growth for our employees.
I'm glad you mentioned it because it goes back to alignment. And one other word that I would leave with everybody before we wrap here is creativity. This is an incredibly entrepreneurial industry, as everyone knows. When it comes to building strategic compensation plans, you have an unbelievable opportunity to get creative. As you were talking, it reminded me we have a firm that built an associate partnership program like that, right? Where basically they wanted to acknowledge you could be a partner one day, you're not ready yet. For 3 years, you can accrue equity, and then you have the right to buy it, and so on. And I was like, wow, you just kind of did that in a car ride home from a client meeting with a couple people on your team. And it's actually really smart, and it seems to be working really well. So with that, I hope that these experts up here gave you the ability to get your creative juices flowing. Shannon, Allison, thank you so much for doing this. It's incredibly informative. Appreciate it. We'll see you guys on the boardwalk.